On August the 1st, the New York Times reported that the Trump administration, via the Department of Justice, would soon launch investigations into and potentially suing universities they deemed to be discriminating against white applicants. Attorney General Jeff Sessions has long opposed affirmative action, like much of Trump's base. This internal document has been exposed at a time when Trump's poll numbers are at historic lows. So he may be looking to do something to appeal to his base, which is more driven by racial animus than many folks want to admit. Now, I support affirmative action, and I will explain why in a second. However, there has been a propaganda war against affirmative action from the moment the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed and the subsequent Executive Order 11246 was signed a year later in 1965 by President Lyndon Johnson. What was intended, keyword intended, to go to black people and correct centuries of slavery, Jim Crow apartheid, and systemic abuse was diluted and propagandized over the course of the following decades till now we're at a point where other groups have benefited more from affirmative action than black people. But you never hear anyone actually say that. Unfortunately, President Johnson's executive order was written in a way that allowed for this to happen. Affirmative action only applied to black people in theory, never in action. Listen to what Johnson said when referencing affirmative action in 1965 at Howard University, where he gave the commencement address.
Freedom is the right to share fully and equally in American society, to vote, to hold a job, to enter a public place, to go to school. It is the right to be treated in every part of our national life as a person equal in dignity and promise to all others. But freedom is not enough. You do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying now, you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. You do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, bringing up to the starting line of a race, and then say, you are free to compete with all the others, and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. Thus, it is not enough just to open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. And this is the next and the more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result.
Sometimes it's important to read the text of these policies and laws that get passed so that you know exactly what you will lose if said policy were gutted or fully taken away. Because when it comes to this debate over affirmative action, we get caught up in people's perceptions of what it is versus what the actual policy says it is. For decades since the 60s, conservatives in America have erroneously and intentionally portrayed affirmative action as a giveaway to black people and that it discriminates against whites. There have been claims that affirmative action applies a quota system when that has never been proven, and it's never been proven because it's not true, because it's actually illegal. Let's actually read an excerpt of what Executive Order 11246 actually says. Quote, "The contractor will not discriminate against any employee or applicant for employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin." Let me repeat. The contractor will not discriminate against any employee or applicant for employment based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. The contractor will take affirmative action to ensure, there's the key word there, the contractor will take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and that the employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Such action shall include, but not be limited to, the following: employment, upgrading, demotion, or transfer, recruitment or recruitment advertising, layoff or termination, rates of pay, or other forms of compensation, and selection for training, including apprenticeship. End quote. Several amendments to this executive order were added, one in 1967, another one in 2014. The one in 1967 added the word sex in there, and which, of course, applies to gender. And sexual orientation and gender identity was added in 2014 under Barack Obama. Notice at no point did you hear me say anything stating that affirmative action only applies to black people, despite what conservatives would have you believe. Because of how it's been written, affirmative action applies to a ton of people, not just black people, and never has. Yet I still support it, because if you read the executive order, you'll see that to be against affirmative action and to essentially co-sign it being gutted is basically saying that you think employers should have the right to discriminate in all facets of society once again. Being against affirmative action is like saying you want to go back to the pre-1965 era. You think I'm reaching? Look at what happened when the Supreme Court gutted the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in 2013. They claimed Title V of the Voting Rights Act was no longer necessary because society had changed and doesn't discriminate against black voters the way it did back then. Bullshit. We know that was a crock of crap now because we see what's happened since 2013. The moment the states knew they could get away with stifling the black vote, guess what they did? They stifled the black vote. There's been an all-out assault on the voting power of non-whites since 2013 because some justices didn't think racism in voting was still an issue, and how quickly they've been proven wrong. So anyone coming out of their mouths saying we're past that, quote unquote, and we don't need to worry about discrimination in the workplace or in university acceptance anymore will be proven wrong if affirmative action is gutted. To hear people on the left make this erroneous claim has been nothing short of eye-opening, to say the least. On page 25 in his highly regarded book, Black Labor, White Wealth, Claude Anderson talks about the nature of this problem when he writes about the death of the black civil rights movement. He says, and I quote, "As other groups began to take away from blacks control of the civil rights agenda, conservative political forces started using their government and media power to diminish the black component of the civil rights movement. They successfully destroyed the legitimate base of the black movement by diluting the movement beyond recognition. They identified every group that could possibly be perceived as aggrieved and made it equal to that of blacks. Thus, the public perception of blacks was severely diminished and distorted. The unique problems that they faced were made to appear no more important than the problems faced by other so-called victims of discrimination." End quote. The truth that many people don't want to tell you is that affirmative action has benefited white women probably more than any other group. Affirmative action has been key to helping women gain employment and representation in jobs and colleges they were previously blocked from gaining access to. But you never hear conservatives say this, because their problem isn't white women as much as it is black people. There's a good article written at the Huffington Post's Black Voices by Taryn Finley titled 4 Key Points That Debunk Misconceptions Around Affirmative Action. She links to other research in the article, such as the research that shows how in the 2 decades since the passing of affirmative action, white women showed more career growth than any other groups. Okay? They don't talk about this. The idea that whites haven't benefited from affirmative action is one of the biggest social lies that has been told over the past few decades. And Democrats have largely gone along with this propaganda and have absolutely failed at setting the record straight. Affirmative action has been framed as a, quote, black thing by conservatives in America because what they really have always wanted to do is take us back to the pre-1965 era when they could legally discriminate based on race. It's why they ignore the role affirmative action has played in leveling the playing field for white women. Affirmative action has worked, and for some that's the problem. The issue is it hasn't worked well for the group it was originally meant to aid, which is black people. Sure, blacks have benefited somewhat, but we still only make up 12% of the labor force. Affirmative action is the reason why the labor force is as diverse as it is today. If you look at the overall composition of the labor force today, you can see that the monumental role that the policy has played in creating an equal playing field. But the real agenda against it has always been about cutting off that access non-whites now have. According to the Pew Research Center, up until 1970, the majority of black students were still enrolled in HBCUs. But since desegregation and the opening of new doors and opportunity for black students, the share of blacks enrolled in HBCUs has shrunk since then. As of 2015, only 8.5% of blacks who were enrolled in degree-granting institutions were actually enrolled in an HBCU. Okay, 8.5%. So it would appear that most blacks in college today are enrolled in non-HBCUs. Let's not bite our tongue and gloss over the obvious here. This is about cutting off access for black and brown students to higher education. It's about forcing institutions to stop accepting as many non-whites as they are and accepting more whites and using the threat of legal action to do so. The Trump DOJ essentially wants to intimidate colleges into falling in line, despite the fact that the courts have already ruled that affirmative action quotas are unlawful, as I stated earlier, and that when factoring in representation, it has to still be based on whether or not that person is qualified. Businesses and colleges cannot simply hire or accept someone purely because they're black or purely because they're a woman. They have to be black and qualified, a woman and qualified. That hasn't stopped the right from lying to their base for decades, pretending that qualified whites were being passed over in favor of unqualified blacks. The insidiously racist implication being that there's no way a black person can be more qualified than a white person. Hence you get the notion of the, quote, affirmative action hire, which implies that the only reason a black person got where they got is because of affirmative action, and therefore they're not really qualified, which, as I said, would be unlawful and illegal. So as I said earlier, I support affirmative action because not having it would lead to even more discrimination than what we already have. But because of the dilution of affirmative action as a policy, we need to reignite the discussion around policies targeted specifically towards the black community. You can call it identity politics or, quote, oppression Olympics all you want. I don't really care what you call it. The only other group that has been as tortured and attacked consistently in this country as blacks are Native Americans. Most groups have not faced what black people have been forced to endure through the Middle Passage, to slavery, to Jim Crow, to mass incarceration. To pretend that there is equal oppression among all groups is to maintain a convenient lie. I am a major supporter of reparations to black people, and I've written about this on several occasions. I'm not saying that you can't do things for other groups because other groups are hurt too. But black people need, not want, but we need attention, and desperately. Our community is suffering and has been trapped in a permanent underclass. I believe there are things we can do ourselves, such as supporting black businesses and crowdfunding black dollars to accumulate enough money to build things in the community that we need. However, we can't ignore the role that government has played in creating this problem. So while we circulate our money in the community, we also need to make a serious and consistent case for reparations. Will a lot of people scoff at this idea? Definitely. A lot of people don't even want blacks to benefit from affirmative action, much less reparations. That shouldn't stop us from doing what we need to do, though, and stop caring and giving a damn about what people are going to say about us. To hell with what they think and what they say. The time for caring about people's feelings needs to come to an end, quite frankly. We're dealing with survival here. We need to take emotions and feeling out of the equation. You know, lost in this discussion about affirmative action is the not so surprising silence on an issue that is much older and arguably much more controversial, and that is the issue of legacy admissions. Notice the silence from white America on the idea of students getting into elite colleges who might actually be underqualified, but they get in purely because their parents and grandparents went to that school. They don't say crap about that because that's not how most black and brown people are getting into college. And this actually is taking the spot of someone who might be more qualified, because the basis of the legacy admission is based purely on lineage, not academic acumen. Legacy admissions overwhelmingly benefit white people, though. Hence the silence. I expect the DOJ to conveniently gloss over this because their target appears to be black and brown applicants, not privileged privileged whites who get into colleges based on lineage alone. Listen, righting the wrongs of the past is not reverse racism, and it's not creating some fictitious black privilege. Okay, it's saying that something wrong has been done that created our present day reality, and to try to correct that, we're going to go out of our way to help the group that was wronged. It doesn't mean that the groups that benefited from the historic bias, like white people, for instance, should be relegated to second-class status or second-class citizenship, or will never receive help in the future, though I think it's important that we attack the talking points from people who would try to deceive you into believing that's what reparations or affirmative action actually means, because that's not what it means. Black people are descendants of slaves living in a country that profiteered for centuries off of free labor, our free labor. In his must-read book, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, author Edward Baptist writes about how slavery is what allowed southern states to dominate the global cotton market in a time when cotton was the world's most widely traded commodity and a key raw material during the first century of the Industrial Revolution. Meaning the Industrial Revolution doesn't happen without cotton picked by black slaves in the American South. Think about the tens of billions, dare say trillions of dollars that was made from the slave labor of black people in this country. You don't think we have a right to lay claim to any of that? You don't think we have the right to say we demand reparations and repayment? It doesn't have to come in the form of money, since the U.S. government would have to pay us trillions of dollars over the course of generations, and that's never going to happen. And to be honest with you, we'd likely just squander that money anyway and give it right back to them. Okay, it can come in other ways, though. I might have to make a separate video about that in the future. But it's something that we need to take a lot more seriously, and we shouldn't be ashamed or feel ashamed in demanding reparations, regardless of what people think about it. In his book, Baptist also explains how entirely new financial tools were invented to profiteer off of black bodies, which changed the entire financial history of the Western world. Tools that included new ways to invest in slavery, essentially a stock market built on slavery. No other group in America has been as integral to the long-term success of this country and the entire world as black Americans. Black people have literally financially propped up America for centuries. So miss me with the tears about affirmative action and reparations. Most people don't realize and don't care to realize how much their position in America has been based off of blacks not having access. So yes, I support affirmative action, if for nothing else than to maintain what little access we have. It is by no means the be-all end-all, however. If you like this video, make sure you like it and subscribe. You can find more of my writings on my blog at www.blackandintellectual.com.